There are nights when the world feels older than it should, when the wind moves through empty places, and the stars seem too distant, too cold, as though they once watched something they no longer wish to see. On such nights, it is easy to imagine that the earth remembers things we have forgotten, that beneath the soil, beneath the stone, there are layers of silence pressing down, holding something back. Humanity has always told stories of floods, not one story but many, scattered across continents and centuries, each carrying the same weight. The waters rose, the world was cleansed, a few survived, and from those few, everything began again. We call it myth, we call it legend. But myths do not arise from nothing. They are echoes, carried forward through generations, shaped by time and forgetting, until only the outline remains. And if we listen closely, we allow the silence between the words to speak, we might hear something else. A whisper beneath the flood, a memory older than the memory we were taught to keep. What if the great flood was not the first ending? What if it was the second? What if there was another world, another age, that came before, were so distant, so lost, that even its destruction was too terrible to name? Perhaps the flood we remember was not a punishment, but a mercy, a way to wash away, not just the wickedness of that time, but the unbearable knowledge of what had already been lost. The ancient traditions do not speak of this openly, they cannot, but they carry it nonetheless, woven into the edges of their telling, hidden in the pauses, in the things left unsaid. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, they remembered the flood, yes, but they also remembered something else, something that came before the gods were named, before the first cities rose from the mud, before humanity knew itself as humanity. They remembered a time when the world was not yet broken. And then, in the oldest tablets, the ones worn smooth by time, there are words that do not quite fit, fragments that seem to belong to an older story, one that was already ancient when it was first written down. They speak of a world that was whole, a world where the sky and the earth were one, where there was no division, no separation, no need for names. And then, something happened. The texts do not say what. They do not say how. They only say that the world was split, that the heavens were torn from the earth, that what had been one became two. And in that division, the Anunnaki, those distant figures who move through the oldest stories like shadows, are remembered as gods. But perhaps they were not gods in the way we imagine. Perhaps they were something quieter, witnesses, watchers, beings who stood at the edge of that first ending and saw what happened when the world came apart. They did not speak of it afterward, not directly, but they carried the memory forward, uncoded in their silence, in their withdrawal, in the way they seemed always to be leaving, always moving further away, until at last they were gone entirely. There is a pattern in the old stories, so subtle it is easy to miss. They teach, they guide, they shape the world, or allow it to shape itself under their distant gaze. And then, always, they depart, not in triumph, not in conquest, but quietly, as though their work is finished, or as though they have seen enough other wish to witness. What if that departure was not arbitrary? What if they left because they had seen it before? Because they knew how it would end? What if the world they helped to rebuild after the first ending was always destined to fall again twice? The Great Flood, as it is remembered, is a story of judgment. The waters came because humanity had grown wicked, corrupt, beyond redemption. But judgment implies a choice. It implies that things could have been different. And yet, in the oldest versions of the story, there is no sense of surprise, no shock, only a quiet, inevitable unfolding, as though everyone, gods and mortals alike, already knew what was coming, as though the flood was not a punishment, but a conclusion, the end of something that had already ended once before. Perhaps the first ending was worse. Perhaps it was so complete, not because it was forbidden, but because there were no words for it, no frame of reference, no way to hold it in the mind without shattering. And so, when the survivors emerge, see, there were survivors. They did not speak of what they had seen. They only carried it forward in fragments, in images, in dreams that woke them in the night and left them trembling, unable to explain why the flood traditions across the world share certain details, the waters, the ark, the survivors. But they also share something else, something less obvious, a sense of repetition in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The flood survivor Utnapishtim speaks to Gilgamesh as though from a great distance, not just in space but in time. He speaks as though he is remembering something that was already a memory when he lived it, as though the flood he survived was itself an echo of an older catastrophe, one that could not be named but could only be pointed to, carefully, obliquely, in the way one might point to a scar without explaining the wound. What if that older catastrophe was the true first ending? What if the world that existed before the flood was not the original world, but a second attempt, a rebuilding? What if the Anunnaki, those quiet, fading figures, were the remnants of that earlier age, survivors of a destruction so profound that even they, immortal or nearly so, were changed by it? What if they helped humanity rebuild not out of benevolence, but out of grief, out of a need to see if it could be done differently this time? The Sumerian king list, that strange and haunted document, speaks of reigns that lasted thousands of years, of kings who ruled before the flood, when time itself seemed to move differently. It speaks of a world where mortality had not yet settled fully into the bones of things. And then the flood came, and afterward the reigns grew shorter. The kings became more human. The world became more familiar. But the list does not explain why. It does not say what changed. It only marks the division, the before and after, as though the flood was a line drawn across history, separating what could be remembered from what could not. What if that line was not the first? What if there was another division further back, so far back that even the oldest records could not reach it? What if the world before the kings, before the cities, before the first inscriptions on clay, was a world that had already been remade once? A world built on the ruins of something older, something that had been deliberately erased, not by time, but by those who survived it. Eraser is not always violent. Sometimes it is necessary, sometimes it is the only way to move forward. If the first ending was too terrible to bear, then perhaps the only mercy was to forget it, to let it sink beneath the surface of memory, to bury it so deep that only the faintest tremors remained. And then, when the second ending came, the flood became easier to remember. Not because it was less terrible, but because it was familiar, because it was the second time, because the survivors already knew how to carry that weight. The gods, if they were gods, withdrew after the flood. They did not vanish, they did not die. They simply stepped back, as though their part was finished, as though they had done what they could, and now it was up to humanity to continue alone. But perhaps that withdrawal was not a sign of completion. Perhaps it was a sign of exhaustion, or fear, or the knowledge that if they stayed, if they continued to guide and shape and intervene, they had seen it once. They had seen it twice, and they could not bear to see it a third time. In the silence after the flood, humanity began again. Cities rose, fields were planted, the wheel was invented, then writing, then law, civilization, as we understand it, began to take shape. But it did so in the shadow of something enormous and unspoken, a knowledge carried quietly, passed down through generations, never quite articulated but never quite forgotten, the knowledge that the world had ended before, not once, but twice, and that it could end again. The flood traditions do not speak of the earlier ending directly. It is too far back, too buried, too wrapped in layers of silence and forgetting. But they gesture toward it in the way they describe the world before the flood, not as innocent or pure, but as old, as tired, as though it had been carrying something for a very long time and could no longer hold it. And the way the gods are described, not as angry, but as sorrowful, as though they grieved for what was being lost, even as they allowed it to be lost. As though they knew better than anyone that sometimes the only way to heal is to let go completely. What if the Great Flood was not a judgment, but a forgetting, a deliberate severing of the past, so that humanity could begin again without the weight of what came before? What if the gods, the Anunnaki, the Watchers, the silent teachers, got the gift of survival, but the gift of amnesia, the gift of not knowing how bad it had been the first time, And if that is true, then what was the first ending? What came before the before? What was so terrible that even the memory of it had to be washed away? There are places in the old stories where the narrative falters, where the words seem to circle something they cannot quite name, where the scribes, writing thousands of years ago, pause, and in that pause you can almost feel them looking over their shoulder, as though checking to see if anyone is listening. These moments are rare, but they are there, embedded in the texts, like stones in a river, smoothing with time but never quite disappearing. The Mesopotamian tradition speaks of a time called mu.ul, the former time, a phrase so old that even the later Babylonians did not fully understand it. It appears in fragments, in passing references, always with a sense of distance, as though it belonged to a world that was not quite this one. The former time, not the time before the flood, but the time before the former time, a shocking that leads nowhere or leads too far back to follow. The scribes did not elaborate. Perhaps they could not. Perhaps they were writing down something they themselves had inherited incomplete, a memory already worn smooth by centuries of retelling, until only the shape remained in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, the primordial waters, mingling together before anything existed. And then there is conflict. The younger gods rise against the older ones. Marduk slays Tiamat, splits her body, and from her remains creates the heavens and the earth. It is a violent creation, a world born from destruction. But the text does not say why the conflict began. It does not explain what Tiamat and Apsu did to provoke the younger gods. It only says that they were ancient, that they were there first, and that they had to be destroyed for the new world to exist. What if Tiamat was not a monster, but a memory? What if she represented the old world, the world before the division, the world that had to be torn apart so that the new one could begin? What if the slaying was not a battle, but a metaphor for the first ending, the catastrophe that split the sky from the earth, the waters from the land, the past from the present? The Anunnaki do not appear in the Enuma Elish as warriors. They appear afterward as observers, as silent witnesses to what Marduk has done. They gather, they acknowledge, and then they withdraw. It is as though they are not part of the new creation, but remnants of the old one. Beings who survived the division and now exist in the space between what was and what is. They do not fight. They do not claim dominion. They simply watch, and in their watching there is a sadness that the text does not explain. Perhaps they remembered what she was before she became a symbol of chaos. Perhaps they remembered the world when it was whole, when there was no need for division, when the sky and the earth were not yet separated, and perhaps when they saw Marduk split her body and create the new world from her remains. They understood that this was not the first time it had happened, that creation is always built on the bones of what came before, that every beginning is also an ending. The Sumerian texts speak of the Abzu, the deep fresh water beneath the earth, the source of all life and wisdom. Enki, the god of wisdom, is said to dwell there in the depths far below the world of mortals. But the Abzu is also described as ancient, older than the gods themselves. It is not something Enki created. It is something he inherited, something he guards. And in some fragments, there are hints that the Abzu was once above, not below, that it was once the sky, or part of the sky, and that it fell, or was cast down, during some unimaginable catastrophe that the texts do not name. What if the Abzu is the remnant of the first world? What if it is the memory of the sky before it was separated from the earth? What if it fell during the first ending, and now it lies beneath everything, forgotten by most, remembered only by those who descend into the depths and listen to what the water has to say? Enki is a curious figure. He is wise, but his wisdom is not the wisdom of authority. It is the wisdom of one who has seen too much. He does not command, he suggests, he whispers, he offers alternatives. In the flood story, it is Enki who warns Utnapishtim, who tells him to build the ark, who preserves a remnant of humanity against the will of the other gods. But he does so secretly, indirectly, speaking through the walls of a reed hut so that he is not technically breaking his oath. It is the act of someone who has learned to work around the edges of fate, who knows that he cannot stop what is coming but can perhaps soften it, preserve a fragment, ensure that the ending is not quite total. Why does Enki act this way? Why does he preserve humanity when the other gods have decided it must be destroyed? The texts do not say, but perhaps it is because he remembers. Perhaps he was there during the first ending, and he knows what it means to lose everything, to watch a world come apart and have no way to stop it. Perhaps he saved humanity not out of love, but out of a desperate need to ensure that this time something would survive, that the second ending would not be as complete as the first. The other gods do not share his concern. Enlil, the god of wind and storm, is furious when he discovers that Utnapishtim has survived. He rages. He demands to know who betrayed the decision, but his anger is not the anger of a tyrant. It is the anger of someone who believes the ending should have been final, who thinks that mercy only prolongs suffering, who has perhaps seen what happens when remnants survive and carry forward the seeds of the same corruption, the same fractures, the same inevitable collapse. What if Enlil too remembered the first ending? What if his harshness was not cruelty but a kind of terrible wisdom? The wisdom of knowing that sometimes the only way to truly heal is to let the wound close completely, to allow no remnants, no survivors, no lingering threads that might unravel into the same pattern again. But Enki prevailed. Humanity survived. The flood ended, the waters receded, and the world began again. But it began with a weight, a knowledge perhaps unspoken, perhaps unconscious, that this was not the first time that the world had been remade before, and that it could be unmade again. The post-flood world, as described in the ancient text, is different, more fragile. The kings no longer live for thousands of years. The gods no longer walk among mortals as they once did. There is a distance now, a separation that was not there before, or was there, but has widened. Humanity is on its own, or nearly so. The gods have withdrawn, not entirely, but enough that their presence is felt more as absence than as presence. They send signs, they send dreams, but they do not come down. They do not intervene, not in the way they used to. Why? What changed? The texts do not explain. They only record the shift, the long rains and the short ones, the time when gods and mortals mingled, and the time when they no longer did. It is as though the flood was not just a physical event, but a metaphysical one, a barrier, a line that could not be crossed again, or could only be crossed at great cost. Perhaps the first ending taught the gods something. Perhaps it taught them that intervention has consequences, that shaping a world, guiding it, trying to prevent its collapse, only delays the inevitable and makes the collapse worse when it finally comes. Perhaps they withdrew after the flood, not because they had lost interest, but because they had learned that their presence itself was part of the problem, that as long as they remained, humanity would never truly stand on its own, and if humanity could not stand on its own, then the cycle would continue, the corruption, the fracture, again and again and again. The memory of the first ending, if it exists at all, is buried so deep that it can only be inferred. It cannot be proven. It cannot be excavated. There are no tablets that describe it directly, no monuments that commemorate it, no oral traditions that preserve its details. And yet there is something in the texture of the oldest stories, something in the way they move, that suggests they are built on a foundation we cannot see, a foundation that goes down further than we can reach, into layers of time that are no longer accessible, that were perhaps deliberately sealed off so that what came after could exist without being crushed by the weight of what came before. In the later traditions, the ones that arose after the flood, there is a recurring motif, the idea of a primordial mound, a piece of land that emerged first from the waters, on which the first temple was built, the first city founded, the first altar raised. The Egyptians had their Benben. The Sumerians had the Duku, the holy mound. It is always described as ancient, as the place where creation began, or where it began again. But it is also always described as a remnant, a survivor, something that was not created, but that remained, that endured when everything else was swept away. What if the primordial mound is not a symbol, but a memory? What if it is the remnant of the first world, the only piece of it that survived the first ending. What if the second world, the world of the flood, was built on top of it quite literally, so that the foundation of everything we know rests on something older, something that predates not just history, but prehistory itself? The gods built their temples on these mounds. They marked them as sacred, but they did not explain why. They did not say what made them different from any other piece of land. They only insisted that these were the places where heaven and earth met, where the divine and the mortal touched, where the boundaries were thinnest, as though these places were scars, as though they were the places where the first wound was made, where the world was first split, and the memory of that splitting could still be felt, even if it could no longer be understood. Humanity built on those mounds, because the gods told them to, but perhaps the gods built there because they had no choice. Because those were the only places left where the old world could still be touched, where the remnants of what came before were still present, buried beneath layers of mud and time, but not gone. Not entirely. What if every temple, every ziggurat, every sacred space in the ancient world was built on top of a memory of the first ending, pressed down into the earth like a fossil, invisible but indelible, shaping ever being seen? The earliest cities rose from the mud as though they had always been there, waiting. Eridu. Ur. They did not emerge gradually, the way we imagine civilization should unfold, then towns, then cities. Instead, they appeared almost fully formed, with temples already standing, with irrigation systems already carved into the earth, with laws and hierarchies and knowledge that seemed to come from somewhere else, somewhere older. The archaeologists call this the urban revolution, as though revolution is the right word, as though it explains anything. But revolutions are violent. They are breaks. And what happened in Sumer did not feel like a break. It felt like a continuation, like something resuming after a very long pause. The Sumerians themselves did not claim to have invented their civilization. They said it was given to them, brought down from the heavens, taught by the Anunnaki, or by the Apkallu, the seven sages. Those strange figures who appear in the oldest fragments, described sometimes as fishmen, sometimes as beings of light, sometimes simply as the wise ones who came before. They taught humanity the sacred arts, writing, map building, and then, like the gods, they withdrew. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but slowly over generations, until they were more legend than memory, more symbol than history. Why did they leave? The texts do not say. They only record that the sages came, they taught, and then they were gone, as though their task had been completed, or as though they knew their time was limited. As though they understood that if they stayed too long, they would become part of the cycle they were trying to prevent. The Apkallu are said to have come before the flood, all 7 of them. They existed in the old world, the world that was washed away, and yet their knowledge survived. It passed through the waters. It emerged on the other side, intact, or nearly so, preserved in the hands of those who remembered. But if the flood was meant to be a cleansing, a total reset, then how did the knowledge survive? How did the memory endure? Unless the flood was not meant to erase everything. Unless it was only meant to erase certain things. The corruption, the fracture, the weight of whatever had happened in the first ending. But the knowledge itself, the sacred knowledge, that was allowed to remain, perhaps because without it, humanity could not rebuild. Perhaps because the gods, or the sages, or whoever they were, understood that starting from nothing would only lead. Or perhaps the knowledge survived because it had survived before, because it was older than the flood, older than the first ending, because it came from a time so distant that even the flood could not reach it, could not wash it away, a time when the world was not yet broken, when the sky and the earth were still one, when there was no need for division, no need for names, no need for the careful, fragile structures that hold civilization together. The Sumerians wrote on clay. They pressed their marks into soft tablets and baked them hard, preserving their words for thousands of years. But clay is fragile. It cracks. And yet the knowledge endured, not because the medium was strong, but because the knowledge itself was necessary, because humanity needed it to survive, because without it the world would slide back into chaos, into the formless waters, into the void that existed before creation, or before the second creation. In the deepest layers of Eridu, the oldest city, archaeologists have found something strange beneath the temples. Beneath the first foundations, there are older foundations, layers upon layers, going down further than the history should allow, as though the city was built and rebuilt, over and over, on the same spot. As though there was something about that place that demanded return, that pulled people back again and again, even after destruction, even after abandonment. The excavations stopped before reaching the bottom. The water table rose. The earth became too unstable, but the layers continued down into the dark, into the wet soil, into places that have not been touched in millennia. What is down there? What lies beneath the oldest temple, beneath the oldest altar, beneath the oldest remnant of human civilization? The archaeologists do not know. The texts do not say, but the Sumerians believe that Eridu was the first city. Not the first city of their time, but the first city ever, the place where civilization began, or began again. They called it the City of the Abzu. The city built over the deep waters, over the source of all wisdom and all life. They said Enki dwelt there in the depths, guarding the many divine principles, the sacred knowledge that made civilization possible. But the me are described strangely, not as things Enki created, but as things he possessed, things he guarded, things that existed before him, that he inherited, or claimed, or was given to keep. In one story, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu and tricks Enki into giving her the May, which she then carries to her own city. Uruk Enki, drunk and careless, offers them freely, and only realizes his mistake when it is too late, when Inanna has already fled with the sacred principles clutched to her chest. He sends servants to stop her, but she escapes. The me are hers now. Civilization spreads. The knowledge moves from one city to another, no longer bound to a single place, no longer under the control of a single god. It is a strange story, almost comic in its telling. But beneath the surface, there is something else, a sense that the me were never meant to be given away, that they were meant to remain in the depths, hidden, protected, kept separate from the world above, and that by releasing them, by allowing them to spread, Enki set in motion something that could not be stopped, something that would eventually lead to the same collapse, the same fracture, the same ending that had come before. Or perhaps he knew, perhaps he understood that keeping the me locked away would only delay the inevitable, that civilization would arise with or without them, but without them it would be crueler, more chaotic, more likely to destroy itself quickly rather than slowly. Perhaps the me were a gift, but also a burden, a way to extend the cycle, to give humanity more time, even knowing that the time would eventually run out. The myths speak of ages, not historical ages, not periods we can measure or date, but cosmic ages. The Sumerians had their own version of this, though it is less clear than the later Hindu yugas or the Greek ages of man. They spoke of a time when gods and mortals lived together, when the boundaries were permeable, when death was not yet fixed. And then something changed. The boundaries hardened. The gods withdrew. Mortality settled into the world like frost. Gilgamesh, the great king, the one who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, went searching for immortality and found only the knowledge that it was no longer available, that the door had closed, that the old ways were gone and would not return. His journey is often read as a personal tragedy, the king who could not accept death. But perhaps it is more than that. Perhaps it is a story about the end of an age, about the moment when humanity realized it was truly alone, that the gods were not coming back, that the old world, the world before the flood, or before the first ending, was gone forever. And all that remained was memory, fragile, uncertain, fading with each generation. Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the one who was granted immortality by the gods after the waters receded. But Utnapishtim does not celebrate his gift. He does not boast. He speaks quietly, almost reluctantly, as though immortality is not a blessing, but a weight, as though he has lived too long, seen too much, carried too many memories that should have been allowed to die. He tells Gilgamesh the story of the flood, and in his telling, there is no triumph, only sorrow. Only the knowledge that he survived, and almost everyone else did not. When Gilgamesh asks how he too can achieve immortality, Utnapishtim does not refuse outright. He sets a test, a simple one. Stay awake for 7 days. Do not sleep. Prove that you can resist even the smallest form of death. Gilgamesh tries, and fails. He falls asleep almost immediately. Utnapishtim shows him the loaves of bread his wife baked each day while he slept, one for each day, now rotting in sequence. Proof that he could not even stay awake, let alone live forever. It is a gentle humiliation. But it is also a lesson. Mortality is not a punishment. It is a condition. And fighting it, resisting it, trying to return to the old ways when gods and mortals mingled and death was not yet fixed. That is futile. The world has changed. The age has passed, and no amount of longing will bring it back. But Utnapishtim does give Gilgamesh one final gift, almost as an afterthought. He tells him of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that can restore youth, that can push back the shadow of death. If only for a time, Gilgamesh dives down, retrieves it, and begins the journey home, thinking perhaps he has found a compromise, a way to extend life without grasping for immortality. But on the way, while he is bathing in a pool, a serpent steals the plant and slithers away, shedding its skin renewed. And Gilgamesh is left with nothing, not even the illusion of hope. The serpent is often read as a symbol of nature, of the wild, reclaiming what was never meant to belong to humanity. But perhaps it is something else. Perhaps it is a reminder, a sign that the knowledge, the power, the gifts of the old world, they cannot be held, they slip away, they return to the depths. They are not for mortals anymore if they ever were. The age of mingling is over, the division is complete. And trying to cross back, trying to reach into the depths and pull something out, will only end in loss. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, but he does not despair. Instead, he looks at his city, at the walls he built, at the streets, the temples, the gardens, at the work of mortal hands, fragile and temporary but real. And he understands, perhaps for the first time, that this is what remains. Not immortality, not the old world, but this, the city, the memory, the story. Carried forward, not in stone or flesh, but in the act of remembering itself. There is a silence in the oldest stories that is louder than any words. A space where something should be but is not. Where the narrative skips, where the chronology fractures, where the listener is left with the unsettling sense that a page has been torn out, a chapter removed, a name erased so thoroughly that even the shape of its absence has been smoothed away. The Sumerians felt this silence. You can hear it in the way their king lists begin. Not with explanation, not with origin, but with an assertion. Kingship descended from heaven, as though that is all that needs to be said, as though asking where it came from before that, or why it descended, or what heaven was before it sent kingship down, would be to ask a question that has no answer, or worse, an answer that must not be spoken. The concept of divine kingship is older than Sumer. It appears in every early civilization, in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley and along the Yellow River. Always with the same structure, the king is not merely a ruler, he is a bridge, a living connection between the mortal world and the divine. Through him the gods speak, through him the chaos that always threatens to return is kept at bay. But if kingship descended from heaven, then what was it before it descended? What form did it take in the divine realm? And why did it need to be brought down at all? Perhaps kingship was not a gift, but a necessity. Perhaps the gods gave it to humanity not as a blessing, but as a structure, a framework to prevent collapse, because they had seen what happened without it. They had seen the first world, the world before division, the world that had no need for kings, because there was no separation, no hierarchy, no distinction between above, and they had seen that world come apart. They had seen what happened when everything was equal, when there were no boundaries, no rules, no center to hold things together. Perhaps that was the lesson of the first ending, that unity without structure leads not to harmony but to dissolution, that the only way to prevent the world from sliding back into formless chaos is to impose order, and the first act of order is to establish hierarchy, to create a king. The king lists record names that stretch back into impossible time. Rulers who reigned for 30,000 years, 40,000, 60,000. Numbers so vast they lose meaning, become mythic, become symbols rather than records. But they are written with the same precision, the same careful cuneiform marks, as the later more plausible reigns. The scribes did not distinguish between myth and history. They recorded both as though both were equally true, equally real, as though time itself operated differently in the older ages, as though years were not years, but something else. Cycles, perhaps, or generations, or simply the weight of memory stretched across gulfs too wide to measure. And then the flood, the line drawn across the list, before and after the reigns shorten, the kings become mortal. But the list does not explain why. It does not say what the flood changed, only that it did change something, that the world afterward was fundamentally different from the world before. Smaller, shorter, more human. What if the first ending changed time in the same way? What if it introduced mortality, or something like it? Not to humanity, but to the world itself. What if the world before the first ending existed in a kind of eternal present, where nothing decayed, nothing aged, nothing ended because there was no concept of ending? And what if the catastrophe that destroyed it did not merely kill the introduced death? Not as an event, but as a principle, a new law written into the fabric of existence, so that everything that came after would carry it, would be marked by it, would be subject to the slow, inevitable unraveling that we call time. The gods in the oldest myths are not eternal. They are long-lived, yes, powerful, yes, but they are not beyond time. They age, though slowly. They tire, they can be wounded, diminished, even killed, though it takes great effort. They are more like very old mortals than like the transcendent, unchanging deities of later theology. And perhaps that is because they too were changed by the first ending. Perhaps they were once something else, something truly eternal, and the catastrophe that tore the world apart also tore them, bound them to time, made them subject to the same laws that govern everything else. They survived, but they were not unchanged. They carried the wound forward, and it shaped everything they did. Enki, dwelling in the Abzu, in the deep waters beneath the world, is described in some texts as weeping. It is a strange image, a god weeping. The texts do not say why. They do not explain what sorrow could touch a being so old, so wise, so far removed from mortal concerns. Because he was there when the first world ended, because he saw what was lost, and he knows it can never be recovered. The Abzu, the deep waters, are not just a place. They are a memory, the remnant of the sky that fell, the heavens that were torn down. Enki guards it, but he cannot restore it. He can only preserve what little remains, and weep for what does not. The flood traditions across the world share another detail, one that is easy to overlook. After the waters recede, after the ark comes to rest, after the survivors promit an agreement between the gods and humanity that it will not happen again in the Hebrew tradition, God sets a rainbow in the sky as a sign in the Mesopotamian tradition, and Lil, after his rage subsides, grants Utnapishtim immortality and places him at the edge of the world, beyond the reach of death. The covenant is always framed as mercy, as the gods relenting, as a gesture of hope, but it is also a boundary, a limit, a declaration that the age of total destruction is over, that from now on, the world will be allowed to continue, even if it is flawed, even if it repeats its mistakes. But what if the covenant was not made after the flood? What if it was made after the first ending? What if the gods, having seen what total annihilation looked like, having witnessed the complete unraveling of the first world, agreed among themselves that they would never allow it to happen again, that no matter what humanity did, no matter how corrupt or broken the world became, they would not permit a return to that original absolute ending? And what if the flood was their attempt to honor that covenant? To cleanse the world, yes, but also to preserve it, to stop it from sliding all the way back into the void. into the formless chaos that existed before creation. Oh, before the second creation. If that is true, then the flood was not the worst thing that could have happened. It was the compromise. The lesser catastrophe. The ending that was allowed because it prevented the greater ending. The one that could not be named. The one that had already happened once and must never happen again. The survivors of the flood carried forward not just their lives, but their memories. Fragmentary, distorted, but real. They remembered a world that was older, stranger, more terrible than the one they now inhabited. They remembered gods who were closer, more present, more involved. They remembered a time when the sky was not yet fixed, when the stars moved differently, when the boundaries between things were not yet hardened into law, and they passed these memories down, generation after generation, until they became stories, and the stories became myths, and the myths became symbols, and the symbols became so abstract, so distant, that most people forgot they had ever been real. But some did not forget. Some carried the knowledge forward with care, with reverence, with the understanding that these were not just stories, but warnings, temps, maps of how the world had broken before and how it might break again. The priests knew, the scribes knew, the builders of the first temples knew. That is why they built on the sacred mounds. That is why they oriented their structures to the heavens, to the movements of the stars, to the cycles that had been observed and recorded since time before time. They were not just worshiping, they were remembering. They were ensuring that the knowledge would not be lost again. That the next time the world came to the edge of collapse, there would be someone who understood what was happening, who could read the signs, who could, perhaps, just perhaps, prevent it from going too far. The ziggurats were not built for the gods. Or rather, they were built for the gods, but not as gifts, as anchors. As physical reminders of the connection between heaven and earth, between the divine and the mortal, between what was and what is. Each one was a miniature mountain, a representation of land to emerge from the waters. But they were also more than representations. They were active. They were meant to be climbed, to be ascended, so that the priest-king could stand at the summit and perform the rituals that kept the world intact, that renewed the covenant, that reminded the gods, and reminded humanity that the division must be maintained, that the boundaries must hold, that the sky and the earth must not be allowed to collapse back into one another. The way they did in the beginning or in the ending that came before the beginning, we remember. The rituals are lost now. The words spoken at the summits of those ziggurats have not survived. The clay tablets that recorded them have crumbled, or were never written down, in the first place preserved only in oral tradition, passed from priest to priest, until the line was broken and the knowledge vanished. But the structures remain silent, empty, eroded by wind and time, and yet even in their ruin, they carry a weight, a presence, as though they are still performing their function, still holding something back, still anchoring the world to a memory that must not be allowed to fade completely. What if the greatest fear of the ancient world was not invasion, not famine, not plague, but forgetting? What if they understood in a way we no longer do, that memory is not passive, that it is not merely the recording of the past, but an active force, a thread that connects what was to what is, and that if that thread is severed, if the memory is lost, then the world itself becomes unmoored, adrift, vulnerable to the same forces that destroyed it before. In the deep night when the city slept and the torches burned low, the priest would climb the ziggurat steps alone. It was not a public act. There were no crowds, no witnesses, no record kept of what was said or done at the summit. Only the priest and the silence and the stars overhead, turning in their ancient patterns. Indifferent and eternal, the rituals performed, they were not prayers in the way we understand. Prayers, careful, deliberate gestures meant to preserve the structure of things, to ensure that the world would continue as it had, that the sun would rise, that the rivers would flow, that the boundary between heaven and earth would hold for one more day. The priest understood something we have forgotten, that the world is not stable, that it does not continue on its own, that it requires attention, intention, the constant renewal of agreements, made so long ago that even the gods no longer remember why they were necessary, only that they are. The world is held together by ritual, by repetition, by the careful reenactment of patterns laid down in the first days, or the second days after the first ending, when the structure had to be rebuilt from fragments, and memory and desperate hope. What if the priests were the true keepers of the memory? Not the kings, not the scribes, but the priests, those who stood in the liminal spaces, who moved between worlds, who carried the weight of what could not be written down because writing was too fragile, too public, too vulnerable to misinterpretation or loss. The priests passed their knowledge orally from master to student, in the innermost chambers of the temples, in the hours before dawn when the world was thinnest, when the past came closest to the present, and the dead could almost be heard whispering through the walls. They spoke of the first ending in metaphors and images, in stories that were not quite stories, but something older, something closer to dream. They spoke of a time when the waters above and the waters below were one, when there was no firmament to separate them, when the world existed in a state of undifferentiated potential. Everything and nothing, all at once. And then came the division, the act that created the world as we know it, but also wounded it, left it split, fervente, always threatening to collapse back into unity, into the formless deep where nothing can exist because there is no distinction, no difference, no space for anything to be itself. The division was necessary. The priest understood this. Without it, there could be no life, no diversity, no multiplicity. But the division was also dangerous, because once something is split, it longs to reunite. The waters above press down, the waters below press up, and between them, the firmament strains, holds, grows thinner with each passing age. The priests perform their rituals to reinforce it, to remind the waters of the boundary, to speak the words that had been spoken at the beginning, that must be spoken again and again, endlessly, or else the whole structure would collapse. But what if the firmament is not just a cosmological feature? What if it is also a metaphor for consciousness, for the human mind, for the fragile barrier that separates memory from forgetting, knowledge from ignorance, the past from the overwhelming present? What if the first ending was not just a physical catastrophe, but a psychic one? A moment when the collective consciousness of the first world collapsed, when the distinctions that allowed thought, language, identity all dissolved, and everything merged back into an undifferentiated whole where there was no self, no other, no way to hold on to anything. The survivors of such an ending would not remember it clearly. They could not. The very act of surviving would require them to rebuild the structures of consciousness, to reestablish the boundaries, to separate themselves from the chaos enough to think, to speak, to say I am, and you are. And this happened, but the memory would remain, buried deep, not as narrative, but as feeling, as a terror that could not be named, as a knowledge that the world is not solid, that consciousness is not guaranteed, that at any moment the boundary could fail and everything could dissolve back into the formless deep. This is what the priests guarded against. Not a physical flood, but a psychic one, a forgetting so complete that it would erase not just history but the capacity for history, the ability to remember at all. They performed their rituals in the dark alone, speaking words that had no meaning to anyone but themselves and the gods. If the gods were still listening, if they had not withdrawn so far that even they could no longer hear, the rituals were a kind of insistence, a refusal to let go, a declaration that the past still mattered, that the memory still held, that the world was still connected to its origins, even if those origins were lost, even if they existed only as fragments, as whispers, as the faint echo of something that might never have been real but could not be allowed to be false. The Anunnaki, in the later periods, became distant. They were no longer described as walking among mortals, teaching, guiding, shaping the world with their hands. They became abstract principles, forces, names invoked in ritual, but rarely encountered in life. The transition was gradual, almost imperceptible. The next spoke only of ancient times, of myths, of stories told by the old priests who claimed to remember when the gods were still present. And then, silence. Or not silence, but a different kind of speech. The gods were still there, the priests insisted. They were still watching from a distance, from the other side of the boundary, from the place where they had always been, even when they seemed close. Perhaps they did not withdraw. Perhaps humanity withdrew. Perhaps the division that separated heaven from earth was not imposed by the gods, but by mortals, who could no longer bear the weight of divine presence, who needed space, distance, autonomy, even if it meant being alone. The first ending might have been a time of too much closeness, too much mingling, when the boundaries were so thin that individuality dissolved, when human and divine bled into each other until neither could exist as itself, and the catastrophe was not separation, but the unbearable pressure of unity. The shattering came not from violence, but from the need to breathe, to have room, to be something distinct. And afterward, the gods respected that. They stepped back, they allowed the boundary to form, they allowed humanity to forget. Not out of cruelty, but out of compassion. Because some memories are too heavy to carry. Some truths are too vast to hold. The gift they gave was not knowledge, but amnesia. The gift was the flood, which washed away not just the corruption of the world, but the unbearable memory of what had come before. And in its place they left stories, fragments, just enough to know that something had happened, but not enough to be crushed by it. The temples, then, were not just places of worship. They were museums of forgetting, repertories of carefully curated absence. The priests preserved what could be preserved, and let the rest sink into the waters, into the Abzu, into the deep place where Enki dwelt, and wept, and guarded the knowledge that must not be spoken, but also must not be lost. It was a delicate balance. Too much memory, and the world would collapse under the weight of the past. Too little, and it would drift untethered, repeating the same mistakes, spiraling toward the same ending. The Mesopotamian world understood this balance, in a way later civilizations did not. Unchanging truths that existed beyond time. The Romans believed in law, in structure, in the power of the state to impose order, but the Mesopotamians believed in cycles. They believed that the world had ended before and would end again. They believed that the gods were not omnipotent, that even they were subject to forces beyond their control, that the best that could be hoped for was not salvation, but delay, a little more time, a little more space to live, to build, to remember, before the waters rose again. And yet, they did not despair. They built their cities anyway. They carved their laws into stone. They planted their fields, and raised their children, and told their stories, knowing that none of it would last forever, that the flood was always coming, if not in their generation, then in the next, or the one after, or the one after that. They lived with the knowledge of impermanence in a way that was neither nihilistic nor escapist. They simply accepted it. They wove it into the fabric of their lives, into their myths, into their rituals, into the way they understood time itself. Perhaps that is the real gift of the ancient world. Not knowledge, not wisdom, not technology or law or empire, but acceptance. The ability to live fully in a world that is always ending, that has always been ending, that will continue to end again and again, and to find meaning not in permanence, but in the act of continuation, in the decision to plant the field even knowing the flood is coming, to build the temple even knowing it will crumble, to tell the story even knowing it will be forgotten. The survivors of the first ending understood this. They had seen the world come apart. They had lived through the unbearable, and they chose to build anyway. Not because they believed it would last, but because the act of building was itself an answer to the void, a refusal, a small, quiet insistence that even in the face of absolute dissolution, even knowing that everything ends, there is still value in the attempt, still meaning in the gesture, still something worth preserving, even if it is only the memory of having tried. And so they built the first cities on the sacred mounds. They raised the first temples, they lit the first fires, and in the flickering light they told the first stories. Not of triumph, not of victory, not of gods who saved them or heroes who conquered death, but of survival, of continuity, of the long, slow work of carrying something forward through time, through catastrophe, through the endless cycle of ending and beginning, knowing that one day the cycle would complete, that the boundary would fail, that the waters would rise one final time and there would be no ark, no mountain, no remnant to carry forward. But not yet. Today, the world still holds. The boundary still stands, the memory still whispers, and that is enough. When the last priest climbed the ziggurat for the final time, when the last ritual was performed and the last words spoken into the dark, did he know it was the end? Did he feel the thread breaking, the connection severing, the long chain of memory finally reaching its limit? Or did he simply descend the steps as he always had, believing that tomorrow another would climb, that the pattern would continue, that the world would hold for one more day? We do not know. The records do not say. The cities fell silent, one by one. The temples empty. The ziggurats crumbled into shapeless mounds, indistinguishable from the earth they rose from. And the knowledge that had been carried so carefully, so deliberately, through thousands of years, slipped quietly beneath the surface, and was lost. But perhaps loss is not the right word. Perhaps it was release. Perhaps the cycle had turned enough times that the pattern was complete, that the lesson had been learned, or had been forgotten so thoroughly that learning it again was no longer possible. The first ending, whatever it was, receded into the deep. The flood followed it down, and the world that remained was a world without that weight, without that shadow, free to begin again in a way that had not been possible before. Or perhaps nothing was resolved. Perhaps the forgetting was not a gift, but a failure. Perhaps we were meant to remember, and we chose not to, because the memory was too heavy, too painful, too vast. And now we live in a world that has cut itself off from its own past, that no longer knows where it came from or why it is the way it is, that mistakes its ignorance for innocence and its amnesia for freedom. The waters still press against the firmament, the boundary still strains. The old priests are gone, but the need for their rituals remains. Whether we recognize it or not, the world still requires maintenance, still demands attention, still needs someone to stand in the liminal spaces and speak the words that hold things together. But there is no one left who remembers the words. No one left who knows where to stand, or when, or why. And so we drift, building and forgetting, ending and beginning, carrying fragments of a story we no longer understand, telling it to ourselves in new forms, new languages, new myths, never quite realizing that we are repeating something very old, something that has been repeated before, many times in many worlds, by many voices, now silent. The Anunnaki are gone. The first ending is buried so deep that even its memory is a memory of a memory. Faint and formless, more feeling than fact. And perhaps that is how it should be. Perhaps some things are meant to be forgotten. Perhaps the only way forward is to let go of the past completely, to release the weight, to allow the world to be new, even if that newness is an illusion, even if beneath it all the same patterns turn the same cycles, repeat the same endings, wait, patient and inevitable. In the dark, the flood came, the flood passed, and in the silence that followed, we began again. And perhaps we always will.